I still remember the exact moment I became an Amish bride. But what I remember even more clearly is the promise they forced me to speak before the marriage. I am 70 years old now, and that promise still lives inside me like a second heartbeat. It never faded. It never softened. It never stopped shaping my thoughts. In our Amish community, marriage is not something you enter with freedom. It is something you step into with obedience already prepared in your hands. Love is not the foundation. Duty is. Silence is. Acceptance is. Before any bride is allowed to marry, she must stand before the elders and speak words that are meant to define the rest of her life. I was only 19 when I stood in that small wooden room. The walls were plain, no decoration, no color, nothing that could distract the eye. Even beauty was considered unnecessary in moments like that. My white dress was simple linen, sewn by my mother's hands. It was not meant to make me feel special. It was meant to make me feel ready. Ready for obedience. Ready for silence. Ready for a life I had not fully understood yet. The air inside that room felt heavier than outside, not because of weather, but because of expectation. 3 elders sat in a straight line in front of me. Their faces were calm, unreadable, and completely steady. Behind me stood my mother. She did not touch me. She did not speak. She only stood there quietly. That is how Amish goodbyes often feel, like emotional distance is part of strength. No tears were allowed to interrupt what was considered sacred. Then the elder in the middle finally spoke. His voice was slow and controlled, like every word had been measured carefully. He said, "Before you become a wife, you must accept the promise." I remember blinking at those words, not fully understanding their weight yet. I thought it would be simple. Things like faithfulness, respect, hard work, things I already believed I could give. But I was wrong. One of the elders placed a folded paper into my hands. It was thin, slightly rough, written in plain English without decoration. No emotion in the writing, no softness, just instruction. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened it, and I began reading the first line. "A wife shall not question the guidance of her husband." I paused for a moment, not because I disagreed, but because I had never heard it said so directly. Still, no one stopped me, so I continued reading. The second line felt heavier than the first. "A wife shall not bring disagreement into the home." I swallowed quietly. My throat suddenly felt dry. The room remained silent, watching me without interruption. Then came the third line. "A wife shall carry silence when peace is needed." At that moment, I thought silence meant calmness. I thought it meant avoiding arguments, avoiding unnecessary noise, but I did not yet understand what kind of silence they truly meant. Then I reached the final instruction. It was not a suggestion, it was a requirement. The elder looked at me and asked one question. "Do you accept this promise without resistance?" Every eye in the room was on me at that moment. My mother still did not look at me. My future husband stood somewhere behind the elders, completely silent. I remember my hands tightening around the paper as I hesitated, not because I wanted to refuse, but because I felt something inside me hesitate, something I could not name, something I did not yet understand. But in that room, hesitation is not something you are allowed to hold for long. So I nodded slowly, and I said the word that changed everything. Yes. That single word became the foundation of my entire married life. Not love, not choice, not freedom, but a promise spoken under pressure I did not fully understand. After that moment, I became a bride in our community. But no one explained that the promise was not symbolic. It was practical. It was meant to shape behavior, silence, and obedience for life. The wedding itself was simple, like all Amish weddings. No decoration that would draw attention, no music that felt emotional. Only prayers, quiet movement, and structured order. My husband stood beside me during the ceremony. He looked calm, controlled, respectful. He held my hand, but even that gesture felt measured rather than emotional. At the time, I thought that was normal. I thought all Amish marriages began like this. Quiet, stable, controlled. We moved into a small home on his family's land, a simple wooden house surrounded by fields and animals. Life began in routine immediately. Morning chores, farm work, church preparation, evening silence. Everything followed structure. Everything followed expectation. At first, I believed I could adapt easily. I believed discipline would feel like stability over time. But slowly, I began noticing something I could not ignore. The promise I made as a bride was not just a wedding formality. It was active inside our daily life. Not loudly, not violently, but constantly shaping what I could say and what I could not. Even small questions felt heavier than they should have been. Even simple suggestions felt unnecessary in his eyes. My husband did not speak harshly. He did not raise his voice. He simply believed deeply in structure. And structure, in our home, always came before discussion. One morning, I asked if we should change something in the kitchen arrangement. He looked at me for a long time without responding. Not angry, not emotional, just still. Then he said, "It is already arranged properly." That was the end of the conversation. No explanation, no discussion, no continuation. And slowly, I began to understand something important. Silence was not just absence of speech in our marriage. It was a system that determined what existed and what did not. Over the years, I learned to speak less. Not because I stopped having thoughts, but because thoughts that cannot be spoken begin to feel unnecessary. Even my emotions started becoming quieter. Not gone, just buried deeper where they would not disturb anything. Our life continued like this for many years, stable from the outside, controlled from within. And I thought this was simply how Amish marriage was meant to be. Until one evening, I found that old promise again, folded inside a wooden drawer I had not opened in years. And when I read it as an older woman, I finally understood something I had missed at 19. That promise was not just about marriage. It was about silence becoming a rule for life itself. And that realization changed everything I thought I understood. Because that night, I heard footsteps behind me, and my husband said something he had never said before in all our years of marriage. And I knew the promise I made as a bride was no longer in the past. It was still alive. That night, when I heard footsteps behind me, I did not turn right away. Something inside me already knew the moment had changed, not because of fear, but because silence suddenly felt different in the room. My husband stood behind me for a long time before speaking, long enough that I started to feel the weight of his presence. Then he finally asked, "Why are you reading that again after so many years?" His voice was calm, but not ordinary calm. It carried something tight underneath, like restraint being held together carefully. I slowly closed the paper, but I did not answer immediately, because I did not know how to explain why I had found it again, or why it suddenly felt heavier than it did when I was 19. "I forgot it was still here," I said quietly. That was not the full truth. But in our home, full truth was never something spoken easily. He sat down across from me without taking his eyes off my face. That was unusual. My husband rarely looked directly at emotions for long. He believed emotion could disturb clarity. Silence was his way of keeping everything controlled and steady. But that night, his silence felt different. Less like peace, more like pressure. After a moment, he said something I did not expect. "That promise is not something you should think about too much." I nodded slowly, as I always did. But inside, something shifted, because his words sounded less like advice and more like warning. Days passed after that without any mention of the paper. Life returned to its usual rhythm: morning chores, barn work, cooking, church preparation. Everything stayed predictable, like it always had been. But I started noticing small changes in him, not in his actions, but in his awareness. He became more careful when speaking, even more selective than before. As if even small words now carried weight he was measuring twice. One morning at breakfast, I tried asking a simple question, something small about the winter supplies for the horses. He paused for a moment longer than usual before answering, then said, "It is already handled." and continued eating without further discussion. But that pause stayed in my mind longer than his answer, because it felt like he had to decide something before speaking. Not what to say, but whether to say anything at all. That was when I realized something was changing between us. Not openly, not loudly, but slowly, like a structure shifting under its own weight. In Amish life, silence is not unusual, but this silence was different. This one felt controlled even more tightly than before, as if something in him was being carefully locked away again. I began to observe him more closely after that, not out of suspicion, but out of quiet curiosity. He still worked the same, still followed every routine perfectly, still attended church, still fulfilled every expectation of the community. From the outside, nothing had changed, but I could feel something behind it all, like a door inside him had been closed again, more firmly this time. One evening, while we sat near the candlelight, I tried speaking again, not about the promise, just something simple. "How was your day?" He looked at me briefly, then answered, "It was as expected," and went back to silence. That was the end of the conversation. No continuation, no detail, no emotion. I remember watching the candle flicker that night for a long time, thinking about how silence could become so complete between two people. Not empty, but controlled. Like every word had to pass through invisible permission first. The promise I made as a bride began to feel less like memory and more like something still operating inside our daily life. Not spoken, not discussed, but quietly shaping everything. Even how I thought before I spoke. Even how I stopped myself from asking questions. Because every time I wanted to speak freely, I remembered his rule. Not just his rule anymore. The promise I once agreed to as a young bride. Years passed like this, slowly, without visible conflict. From the outside, our life looked stable and faithful. But inside, something was becoming harder to ignore. Silence was no longer just part of our marriage. It was becoming the structure holding it together. And anything held too tightly, eventually begins to feel like pressure. Still, I did not question it out loud, because questioning in our home was never encouraged. It was simply replaced with silence. But deep inside me, something was beginning to wake up again. Something that had been quiet since the day I said yes in that room. And I did not yet know that this silence was only temporary. Because the promise I made as a bride was about to be tested in a way I never expected. It started with something so small, I almost ignored it. A sound, a pause, a shift in the way my husband breathed at night. Nothing that anyone else would notice, but after decades of silence in marriage, you learn how to hear what is not spoken. That evening, he came home later than usual from the barn. The horses were restless, and I could hear the buggy outside before I saw him. When he stepped inside, he did not remove his coat right away. He just stood near the door for a moment, like he was deciding something. That was not normal for him. Everything my husband did had a sequence, an order, a discipline. But that night, he broke his own rhythm. "I need to go to the church office tomorrow," he said finally. No explanation, no detail. Just a sentence dropped into the room like a stone into water. I nodded, as I always did, but inside I felt something tighten. Because church office visits were not ordinary in our life. They usually meant records, elders, or something serious being discussed. The next morning, he left before sunrise without eating breakfast. Again, unusual. I stood at the window watching him leave in the buggy. The wheels moved slowly through the cold morning ground, and I noticed something strange in the way he held the reins. Not relaxed, not steady, but controlled. Almost too controlled. Like someone holding themselves together by force. Days passed, and he became even quieter than before, if that was even possible. But now it was not peaceful silence anymore. It was guarded silence. The kind that protects something fragile inside it. One afternoon, I went to the storage room to get supplies. That was when I saw something I was not meant to see. A small sealed envelope, placed carefully inside a wooden box he normally never allowed me to open. My name was not on it, but the handwriting was his. Slow, controlled, familiar. My hand stayed still for a long time before I touched it. because something about it felt like a boundary I should not cross. But silence had already taught me one thing over the years. If something is hidden too carefully, it usually means it matters. I opened it. Inside was not a letter. It was a second copy of the same promise I made as a bride, the exact same rules, the exact same wording. But underneath it was something written in his hand, a single line. Some promises are not made once. They are enforced twice. My heart stopped for a moment, because I did not understand what that meant. Not yet. That evening I placed the paper back exactly where I found it and said nothing, because in our home, silence was always safer than questions. But that night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about that sentence, enforced twice. What did that even mean? Was it about marriage? About rules? About something I never knew? The next morning, I noticed something else. My husband was watching me differently, not in a controlling way, but in a cautious way, like he was waiting for something I had not done yet, or something I had already discovered. At breakfast, I tried speaking again, just a simple question, but before I could finish, he interrupted softly. "Today will be a long day," he said. And that was all. No discussion, no continuation. But his interruption was not about the conversation. It felt like it was about the direction I was heading. That afternoon, a visitor arrived at our home, a man from the church committee. I had seen him before, but never alone at our house. He spoke quietly with my husband outside. Their voices were low, but not calm, careful, measured, serious. And when the visitor left, my husband did not come inside right away. He stood outside for a long time, looking at the ground, like something had already happened, but not yet reached me fully. That was the moment I realized something deeply unsettling. This was not about a memory anymore. This was about something still active in our present life, something connected to that promise, something I had agreed to without understanding its full meaning. And now, it was no longer staying buried. It was beginning to surface in pieces, quietly, slowly, unavoidably. And I had no idea yet that the next part would change everything I believed about my husband and that promise I made as a young Amish bride. That night felt different before anything even happened. Not because of noise, but because of how silent everything had become. Even the wind outside our house seemed careful, like it was not allowed to disturb anything. My husband came home later than usual again, but this time, he did not come inside right away. I watched him through the small window near the kitchen. He stood outside in the dark for a long time, holding the reins loosely, not resting, not thinking, just waiting. That waiting scared me more than anything else, because my husband never waited without reason. He always moved with purpose, like every moment had direction. When he finally entered the house, he did not look at me immediately. He removed his coat slowly, carefully, like each movement mattered more than usual. Then he sat down at the table without speaking. No greeting, no explanation, just silence, heavier than I had ever felt it before. I finally spoke first. "Is everything all right?" My voice sounded too small in that moment. He did not answer immediately. That pause again, the same pause I had started fearing. Then he said, "You found the paper." My hands went still, because it was not a question, it was confirmation. I nodded slowly, and for the first time in many years, I did not immediately look away. He exhaled once, long and slow, like something inside him had finally reached its limit. Then he said something I was never prepared to hear. "That promise you made was not only about marriage." My heart tightened instantly, because that was exactly what I had begun to suspect, but hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a different way. He continued, "It was a protection rule." I did not understand at first. Protection from what? From whom? He looked at me then, properly, fully, and I saw something in his eyes I had never noticed before. Not control, not discipline, but burden. A burden he had been carrying alone for years. He finally spoke again. There was a time before our marriage when my life was not stable. His words were slow, careful, chosen like they hurt to release. I stayed silent, because this was no longer just a conversation. It was something breaking open after being sealed for too long. He continued. The promise was created by the elders, not for obedience, but for control of past ties. My breath slowed. Past ties. Those words landed heavily in my mind. I remembered the envelope, the second copy of the promise, and the line he wrote. Some promises are enforced twice. Now I understood, a little more, but not fully. He stood up slowly from the table and walked near the door, not leaving, just needing space. Then he said the final part. The promise was meant to prevent contact with something I left behind. I felt my chest tighten. Something, not someone. Or maybe, someone he could not fully name. I finally asked very quietly, "Why did you marry me then?" That question changed the room completely. He turned back slowly, and for the first time, his silence broke in a different way. Not controlled, not disciplined, but honest. Because I thought distance would end memory, he said. But memory does not end with distance. A long silence followed after that. Not the usual silence we lived with. This one felt exposed, real. He sat back down again, this time without structure in his posture. For the first time, I saw him not as a man of rules, but as a man who had been living inside those rules to survive himself. And then he said something that completely changed everything I believed. I did not enforce the promise on you to control you. I enforced it to protect both of us from what could return. My mind went completely still, because now I understood the truth was not simple. It was not just obedience, not just marriage, not just Amish rules. It was prevention, from something in his past that the elders feared more than anything else. And I was part of that structure without ever knowing why. The silence in our home suddenly felt different after that moment. Not peaceful, not stable, but fragile. Like it could break at any time. I looked at him for a long time and asked one last question. Is it still coming back? He did not answer immediately, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. Because some silences are not empty. They are waiting. And in that moment, I realized our entire life had been built on waiting for something neither of us could fully escape.